There is a kind of stillness that only comes when the world has finally quieted down, when the last message has been sent, the last light turned off, and your body begins to remember what it feels like to simply rest. If you're listening now, you're already halfway there. Your breath is slowing. Your thoughts are softening. You're no longer holding on to the day. You're letting it go. And in this space, where time moves like mist over a garden at dawn, we can begin. Welcome. Welcome to this quiet journey through the life of a woman who shaped an age without ever raising her voice. A queen who reigned for more than 60 years, who saw the world transform from horse-drawn carriages to steam trains, from handwritten letters to telegraphs that carried words across oceans in moments. But before she became the symbol of an empire, she was just a girl in a palace, writing in her diary by candlelight, wondering what her life might become. If you're lying in bed now, wrapped in a blanket, listening from a city where the streets are still alive with distant sounds, or from a village where the only movement is the rustle of leaves in the wind, know that you're not alone. People all over the world are tuning in tonight, from places where it's already morning, where the sun is rising over rooftops and coffee is being poured, to others where the night is just deepening and the stars are coming out one by one. We're all here together in this shared moment of calm. And if you'd like to stay in this space, to return again and again for stories that help you slow down, that speak to the quiet part of you that still believes in depth, in feeling, in the power of a voice that doesn't shout, then this is your invitation to subscribe so you never miss a journey into the past. And if you'd like, you can leave a whisper in the comments, just a simple, "I'm here," and the time where you are. It doesn't need to be long. It can be just your city, your country, the name of the room you're in. Because it's a small thing, but it reminds us that history is not just made in palaces and parliaments. It's lived in bedrooms, kitchens, gardens, and train stations in every corner of the earth. And when you share where you are, you become part of the story too, part of the quiet community that gathers here, night after night, to remember, to feel, to rest. And speaking of palaces, if your only image of Queen Victoria comes from that lovely film with Emily Blunt, where she's dashing through Windsor with a look of mild panic and a tiara slightly askew, this story might surprise you. Because behind the crown was a woman of deep feeling, quiet strength, and unexpected modernity. She was not just a monarch. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother, a widow, a ruler who learned to lead not through spectacle, but through presence. She wrote more than 60 volumes of journals. She loved music, dogs, and long walks in the Scottish Highlands. She mourned deeply, loved fiercely, and changed the way a nation saw itself, all while wearing black every single day for decades. We won't rush her story. We won't dramatize it with sudden music or urgent narration. Instead, we'll walk beside her slowly, as if we're following the sound of her footsteps down a long corridor, or the scratch of her pen in the silence of her study. We'll feel the weight of the crown, yes, but also the warmth of a fire in winter, the scent of roses in the garden at Osborne, the quiet hum of a household that never truly sleeps. And if this moment, this voice, this calm, feels like something you want to protect, like a space you'd like to return to, then please take a quiet moment to like this story, not just for the algorithm, but as a gentle signal that this kind of storytelling still matters, that slowness is not weakness, that depth is worth holding on to. But before we meet her, let's go back to a time before her name was known, before the red on the map stretched so far, before the steam whistle became the voice of a new world. Let's step into the England of the early 1800s, a land of fog and firelight, of carriages on cobbled streets, of children playing in the shadows of factories just beginning to rise. A time when the monarchy was not revered, but questioned, when kings were seen as distant, out of touch, more interested in pleasure than duty. It was into this world that a quiet girl was born, far from the center of power, raised under strict rules, taught to be seen and not heard. But something in her was different. Something was waiting. So breathe deeply. Let your body sink a little further into stillness. And let us begin gently, in the years before it all began, in a palace wrapped in morning mist, where a young girl sits by a window, pen in hand, not yet knowing that her life will become the quiet pulse of an empire. Before the name Victoria echoed through the corridors of time, before it was stitched into the fabric of nations, whispered in distant jungles, carved into stone in faraway ports, there was a world still breathing in the rhythm of candlelight and horse hooves. It was an England where the future had not yet arrived, where progress moved not in leaps, but in quiet tremors beneath the surface of everyday life. The air was thick with the scent of wet cobblestones and burning coal, a haze that clung to the city like a second skin, softening the edges of rooftops and turning street lamps into halos in the dusk. London stood not as the polished capital of a global empire, but as a sprawling, uneven city of contrasts, where grand carriages passed children barefoot in alleyways, where gas lights flickered beside homes lit only by fire, where the weight of centuries still pressed upon every decision, every custom, every unspoken rule. This was not a world built for speed, nor for noise, nor for the impatient. It was a world that asked you to slow down, to listen, to feel the texture of wool against your fingers, the chill of a stone floor through thin slippers, the distant chime of a church bell carrying across the fog like a memory. Life unfolded in a rhythm dictated not by clocks, but by the sun, by hunger, by the needs of animals, and the turning of the seasons. In the countryside, where most people still lived, mornings began in silence, broken only by the crow of a rooster or the soft clink of a milk pail. Farmers walked behind plows pulled by horses whose breath rose in clouds above the damp fields, their hooves sinking slightly into the earth after a night of rain. There were no engines, no radios, no electric lights to fracture the darkness, only the steady pulse of nature, the slow arc of days measured in labor and light. A woman would rise before dawn to kindle the fire, her hands moving with practiced care as she arranged kindling, blew gently until flames caught, then placed the kettle above the heat. The sound of water beginning to simmer was a small comfort, a promise of warmth in a house that stayed cold long after sunrise. Breakfast was porridge, thick and plain, eaten in silence or with quiet conversation about the weather, the crops, the health of a neighbor. Children played with sticks and stones, invented games from scraps, learned early how to mend their own clothes and carry water from the well. Comfort was not expected. It was earned, piece by piece, through patience and endurance. Yet even in this world of simplicity, change was already stirring, not with declarations or revolutions, but in the quiet hum of new ideas. In workshops and drawing rooms, men sketched machines that could spin thread faster than any human hand, engines powered by steam that might one day carry people across the country in hours instead of days. The notion of progress, still fragile and uncertain, was taking root in the minds of engineers, inventors, and dreamers who saw beyond the horizon of what was possible. Factories were beginning to rise at the edges of towns, tall and dark against the skyline, their chimneys sending plumes of smoke into the sky like signals from a new era. These were not yet the roaring giants of the Industrial Revolution, but they were its first breaths, hesitant, powerful, irreversible. The first railways were being laid, iron tracks cutting through fields and villages, promising connection, movement, a world that could shrink under the weight of human ingenuity. And though most people still lived as their ancestors had, there was a growing awareness that something was shifting, not all at once, not violently, but steadily, like a river changing its course over decades. The monarchy, in those years, stood not as a symbol of unity or service, but as a relic of a different time, tarnished by scandal and distance. Kings had come and gone, many remembered more for their excesses than their wisdom. There were tales, some true, some exaggerated, of royal banquets that lasted for days, of princes who neglected their duties for pleasure, of palaces filled with whispers and secrets. The people watched from afar, often with skepticism, sometimes with quiet resentment. The crown, once feared and revered, had become something foreign, almost unreal, like a story from a book. It was not hated, but it was not deeply loved either. It existed, like the weather or the tides, as something beyond control, something to be endured rather than celebrated. And yet, in small ways, the old rituals still held power. The changing of the guard at Buckingham House, not yet a palace, but a grand residence, still drew curious onlookers. The sound of a royal carriage on the street made people pause, children run to windows, elders remove their hats. Tradition had not vanished. It had simply faded, like ink left in the sun, still legible, but softer, less commanding. In the homes of the wealthy, life moved to a different rhythm. Mornings began not with labor, but with service. Servants lit fires, drew baths, laid out clothes with care, folding silk and wool with quiet precision. Breakfast was served on silver trays, with tea imported from China, bread from fresh ovens, butter chilled in cellars. The rich spoke of politics, of fashion, of travel. They read newspapers that arrived daily, discussed books, attended concerts, visited estates in the countryside where time moved even slower. Their world was one of refinement, of manners, of subtle hierarchies that governed every gesture, every word. A misplaced glance, an incorrect title, a wrong fork at dinner, these were not small things. They were signs of who you were, where you belonged. And though they lived in the same country as the farmers and laborers, their lives might as well have been on different planets. One moved by candlelight and labor, the other by leisure and inheritance. And yet both existed under the same sky, breathed the same smoky air, listened to the same distant chimes of Big Ben, not yet built, but soon to come, its voice destined to mark the rhythm of a new era. The contrast between these two worlds was vast, though rarely spoken of directly. It was felt in the silence between classes, in the way a servant lowered their eyes when passing a master, in the way a child in a patched coat stepped aside for a carriage with a coat of arms. And yet, both were bound together by the unseen threads of an empire that was growing, quietly, like ivy on a wall, reaching into every corner of the world. Ships from Portsmouth and Liverpool carried goods east and west, returning with spices from India, cotton from the Americas, tea from Ceylon, sugar from the Caribbean. The British Empire was not yet at its height, but its roots were deep, its reach expanding with every tide. And with that expansion came wealth, power, and also suffering, for the hands that harvested the sugar were not free. The lands that produced the cotton were not willingly given. The cultures that traded with Britain did not always do so as equals. But these truths were not yet in the light. They were hidden in the cargo holds of ships, in ledgers kept in offices far from public view, in the silence of those who had no voice to speak. And in the heart of it all, in the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, a young girl was growing up. She was not yet queen. She was not even considered likely to be queen. The line of succession was long, and many believed others would rule before her. But she was watched. She was shaped. She was taught to walk straight, to speak quietly, to write neatly, to obey. Her days were governed by strict routines, by tutors, by her mother, by a man named Sir John Conroy, whose presence cast a long shadow over her childhood. He was ambitious, calculating, and he saw in this girl not a future monarch, but a path to power. He controlled her access to the outside world, limited her friendships, watched her every move. She lived under what she would later call the Kensington system, a regime of isolation and discipline meant to prepare her for rule, but which often felt more like imprisonment than preparation. Still, Within those walls, she grew. She spent hours in a sunlit room, studying history, languages, music. She played the piano softly, her fingers learning the notes of Mozart and Handel, finding in music a voice she could not yet use in words. She walked in the gardens, where roses bloomed in summer and frost covered the fountains in winter. And though she was always accompanied, she learned to listen to the silence between footsteps, to the rustle of leaves, to the distant laughter of children playing beyond the gates. She kept a diary, writing in careful script about her lessons, her thoughts, her longing for freedom. No one knew then that this girl, so closely guarded, so carefully controlled, would one day become the longest reigning monarch of her time. But in those pages, in the quiet honesty of her words, there was already a sense of self, of purpose, of a mind forming its own understanding of duty, of justice, of what it might mean to lead. It was a time of contradictions. Beauty and grime lived side by side. Elegance and suffering shared the same streets. A woman in a silk dress might pass a child shivering in a doorway, both unaware of how deeply their lives were connected by the unseen threads of an empire that was growing, quietly, like ivy on a wall, reaching into every corner of the world. Progress was not kind. It did not come with fairness. It came with smoke, with noise, with displacement. But it came. And the world was not waiting for anyone. It was moving on its own. The first railways were being laid. The telegraph was being imagined. Cities were swelling with people drawn by the promise of work, of a new life. And the old ways, the horse, the candle, the handwritten letter, were beginning their slow retreat into memory. Still, in those final years before Victoria's reign, there was a kind of balance, a sense that the past and the future were holding their breath, that something was about to begin, not with a shout, but with a whisper, not with a war, but with the quiet turning of a page in a young girl's diary. The world was not ready for her, but she was becoming ready for the world, not through grand speeches or public appearances, but through the slow accumulation of thought, of observation, of silent determination. She did not know yet what her role would be, but she was learning how to carry weight, how to listen, how to endure. And so we walked through this England that was not to judge it, not to rush past it, but to feel the weight of a woolen coat on cold mornings, to hear the scratch of a quill on paper, to smell the wax of a candle burning low in a bedroom where a child dreams of a life she cannot yet name, to see the way light falls through a window in Kensington Palace, catching the dust in the air, illuminating a book left open on a table, a cup of tea growing cold beside it. This is not history as a list of events. This is history as a lived experience, as a texture, as a mood. It is the world that shaped her, not through glory, but through quiet moments, through restrictions, through the slow building of a mind that would one day hold an empire in its thoughts. Because before there was a queen, there was a world that shaped her. Before there was an empire in full color on the map, there was a nation waking up slowly to the sound of its own transformation. Before history remembered her, she was simply a girl, listening to the silence, wondering what her voice might one day become. And though she did not know it, the world was already leaning toward her, not because of who she was, but because of what she might represent. A new beginning, a return to dignity, a reign that would not be marked by excess, but by presence. So let us stay here a little longer, in this moment before everything changed. There was a morning in June, the kind that arrives without fanfare, when the light over London did not burst through the clouds, but seeped slowly into the world, like water soaking into old paper. The city was still wrapped in the soft hush of early hour, the streets damp from a night of gentle rain, the air carrying the scent of wet stone, distant smoke, and the faint perfume of roses blooming in a garden somewhere behind a high wall. Birds moved between rooftops with quiet purpose, and the first footsteps on the pavement echoed with a kind of reverence, as if even the waking world knew not to rush. Inside Kensington Palace, the curtains were drawn, but a thin line of gold had found its way through the fabric, falling across the edge of a wooden desk, illuminating a diary left open the night before, its pages filled with careful script, the ink slightly smudged from a finger that had paused too long in thought. And in the bed beyond, a young woman stirred, not from a dream, but from the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had spent the night turning over words in their mind, preparing for a day they could not yet name. She was not yet the figure history would remember, the widow in black, the matriarch of an empire, the woman whose name would define an age. She was simply Victoria, 18 years old, a girl who had spent her life within these walls, shaped by routines, watched by eyes that saw not her heart, but her position. Her childhood had been one of isolation, governed by what they called the Kensington system, a strict, almost suffocating regime of study, silence, and supervision, designed to mold her into a monarch who would be obedient, grateful, and dependent. Her mother had meant well, perhaps, but her presence was often overshadowed by Sir John Conroy, a man whose ambition was quiet but relentless, whose voice carried weight in every decision, every appointment, every letter she was allowed to write. She had grown up with tutors who taught her history, languages, music, but rarely asked her what she thought. She had learned to walk straight, to speak softly, to write neatly, to obey. But in the silence between lessons, in the hours after dusk, when the candles were lit and the house settled into stillness, she had begun to form a mind of her own. She kept a diary, not as a duty, but as a refuge. Every night she would sit at her desk, pen in hand, and write with a kind of honesty that would have startled those who thought they knew her. She wrote of her lessons, yes, but also of her longing for freedom, of her frustration with the restrictions, of her quiet resistance to being shaped like clay in someone else's hands. She did not write with the flourish of a poet or the precision of a statesman. She wrote as someone trying to understand herself, to find her place in a world that had already decided so much for her. And in those private words, there was already a sense of sovereignty, not claimed, not demanded, but simply known. She did not want power for its own sake. She wanted to be heard. She wanted to serve. She wanted to matter, not because of her title, but because of who she was, deep beneath the layers of expectation. The morning she became queen came not with trumpets, not with crowds, not with the roar of celebration, but in the quiet of her bedroom, shortly after sunrise. There was a knock at the door, not harsh, not urgent, but deliberate. It was her mother, accompanied by the Archbishop of Canterbury and a small group of officials, their faces solemn in the dim light. They told her the king was dead. William IV, her uncle, had passed in the night, and she, by the unbroken line of succession, was now sovereign. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She did not collapse into the drama of the moment. Instead, she sat up in bed, smoothed the sheets over her lap, and looked at them with eyes that were wide, but not afraid. Later, she would write that in that instant she felt a deep calm, not the absence of emotion, but the presence of something stronger, a sense of purpose, long buried, now rising to the surface. She asked to be left alone. When the room emptied, she knelt beside the bed and prayed, not for power, not for glory, but for strength, for wisdom, for the ability to do what was right, even when it was difficult. And when she rose, she was no longer just a girl shaped by others. She was a queen, not because of a crown or a proclamation, but because she had chosen, in that silent space between breaths, to become one. Her first act was small, but it carried the weight of a declaration. She asked to be called Victoria, not Alexandrina, the name given to her at birth by her godfather, the Tsar of Russia. It was not a dramatic rejection, not a public statement, but a quiet assertion of self, a refusal to be defined by others' expectations. From that moment on, she would make her own choices, not all at once, not without hesitation, but steadily, like a river finding its course through stone. She moved out of Kensington Palace, away from the influence of Sir John Conroy, whose control over her life had been so complete. She began to meet with her ministers, not as a figurehead, but as someone who listened, questioned, remembered. She studied the reports that came to her desk about poverty in the cities, about trade disputes, about wars being fought in distant lands, and she read them not as abstract matters of state, but as stories of real people living, suffering, hoping. There was a way she carried herself that began to change the atmosphere around her. She did not wear extravagance. She did not seek applause. She dressed simply, often in light colors, her hair pulled back, her hands folded in front of her. When she walked through the halls of the palace, servants would pause, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect. She would nod, sometimes smile, but never with the distant air of royalty. There was a warmth in her presence, a humanity that made people feel seen, even in passing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone of the monarchy began to shift from spectacle to substance, from distance to dignity. Into this new chapter of her life came a young prince from Germany, a cousin named Albert, not as a political arrangement forced upon her, but as a possibility, a quiet invitation to companionship. When they met for the first time at Windsor Castle, it was a cold November morning, the gardens covered in a thin layer of frost, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. She waited for him in the blue drawing-room, nervous in a way she had not been since her accession. But when he entered, something in the air changed. He was not tall, not striking in the way of heroes and paintings, but there was a stillness about him, a quiet intelligence in his eyes, a way of listening that made her feel, for the first time, truly heard. They spoke for hours, not of politics, not of duty, but of music, of art, of science, of the future. He spoke of progress, of how technology could serve humanity, of how beauty and reason could walk hand in hand. He did not flatter her. He challenged her, asked questions, smiled when she laughed. And when he left, she went straight to her diary and wrote, "I really and truly believe he is the man I have been looking for all my life." It was not a declaration of passion, but of recognition, as if she had found not just a husband, but a companion, a mind that could walk beside her through the long years ahead, someone who would not try to rule in her place, but to stand beside her, not above or below, but beside. Their engagement was announced quietly, without the usual fanfare or political posturing. There were no riots, no scandals, no resistance from the public. Instead, there was a sense of relief, as if the nation had been waiting for this moment, for the Queen to have someone who understood her, who could share the weight, who would not seek power for himself. And when they married, it was not in the grandest cathedral, but in the chapel royal at St. James's Palace, surrounded by family, by candles, by the soft sound of an organ, playing a piece composed by Mendelssohn. She wore white, not because it was tradition, but because she liked it. And in that moment, she did not look like a monarch fulfilling a duty. She looked like a woman in love, radiant, grounded, finally free. Albert did not take the title of king. He did not demand it. He became prince consort, a role he shaped with quiet dignity, advising her, organizing exhibitions, supporting education and the arts. He was not her equal in title, but he was her equal in mind, in heart, in purpose. And in the privacy of their home, whether at Buckingham Palace or their retreat in the Scottish Highlands, they built a life that was, for them, deeply ordinary, raising children, walking in the gardens, reading together by the fire. It was not a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. But even in that joy, she knew the path ahead would not be easy. The empire was growing, yes, but so were its contradictions. The factories that powered progress also exploited children. The ships that brought wealth also carried suffering. The laws that governed distant lands were not made with their people in mind. And though she would not speak publicly about these things, they weighed on her, like stones in a pocket. She did not have all the answers. She never would. But she had something else, a quiet determination to do what she could, to listen, to learn, to endure. She did not seek to be loved by everyone. She did not crave popularity. But she wanted to be worthy of the trust placed in her, not by birth, but by choice. And so, in the years that followed, as the world began to move faster, with trains, with telegraphs, with new ideas rushing in like tide, she remained a steady presence. Not loud, not flashy, but there, writing in her diary every night, walking in the gardens at dawn, holding the hand of her husband as they discussed the day's letters, raising their children with a tenderness that surprised those who thought royalty incapable of such things. She was not perfect. She made mistakes. She grieved. She doubted. But she never stopped trying. There was a way she listened, not just to ministers, not just to advisors, but to the silence between words, to the pauses, to the unspoken fears in a servant's voice, to the hesitation in a child's answer. She had learned, in her years of observation, to read not only documents, but people. And in that quiet attention, she began to shape a different kind of monarchy, one not built on distance, but on presence. She visited hospitals. She wrote letters to families who had lost sons in distant wars. She supported causes quietly, without need for recognition. She did not believe in ruling from above, but in walking alongside, even if the path was invisible to most. And slowly, the image of the crown began to change, not through speeches, but through gestures. A nod, a handwritten note, a moment of stillness in a crowded room. She did not always feel strong. There were nights when she sat by the fire, wrapped in a shawl, staring into the flames, wondering if she was doing enough, if she was being fair, if she was truly leading, or simply enduring. But she never let those doubts paralyze her. Instead, she returned to her desk, opened her diary, and wrote, not for history, not for publication, but for herself. In those pages, she was not a queen. She was a woman, tired, hopeful, uncertain, trying. And in that honesty, she found a kind of courage that did not depend on certainty, but on continuity. She did not need to know the end to keep walking. And so, in the quiet years that followed, as the world began to hum with the sound of steam and wire, as cities grew and maps changed and new voices rose from the shadows, she remained a constant, not unchanging, but unwavering. She aged, yes. Her hair turned silver. Her hands grew thin. But her presence, her commitment to duty, her belief in quiet service never faded. She did not seek to be admired. She sought to be useful. And in that simple intention, she became something rare. A monarch who was not just seen, but felt like a steady hand on the rail of a long staircase, guiding without pressure, present without demand. Because that is what this moment was, not a beginning with a bang, but a whisper, a quiet turning. A girl becoming a queen, not through conquest, but through choice. Not through force, but through presence. And as the candles burned low in her study, as the clock ticked softly in the hall, as the wind brushed the trees outside her window, she sat at her desk, pen in hand, and wrote another sentence in a story that was only just beginning. She did not know how long it would last. She did not know how much the world would change. But she knew, with a quiet certainty, that she would walk this path not for glory, not for power, but for peace. And in that simple act of writing, of breathing, of being, she had already begun to shape an age. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself with banners or speeches. but with the quiet turning of a page, the soft closing of a door, the first time a voice speaks without hesitation in a room full of older men. It is not the courage of battle, nor of rebellion, but of beginning, of stepping forward when the path ahead is still unmarked, when the ground beneath your feet feels uncertain, when the weight of expectation presses from all sides, and yet you move anyway. This was the kind of courage Victoria began to know in the early years of her reign, not as a queen born to power, but as a young woman learning, day by day, how to inhabit a role that had once felt too large for her shoulders. She did not stride into history. She walked into it, slowly, thoughtfully, one small decision at a time. Her days now followed a rhythm that was hers to shape. No longer confined by the rigid structure of the Kensington system, she began to build a routine that balanced duty and reflection, public life and private peace. Mornings often began in her private study at Buckingham Palace, a room warmed by a low fire, the windows veiled by thin curtains that softened the London light. She would sit at her desk, wrapped in a shawl, a cup of tea cooling beside her, and read through the dispatches that had arrived overnight, letters from governors in distant colonies, reports from Parliament, petitions from citizens who believed, perhaps naively, that their queen might read their words. And she did. Not all of them, not always in full, but enough to know the texture of the world beyond the palace walls. She underlined passages, made small notes in the margins, sometimes paused, closed her eyes, and imagined the hands that had written those words. A farmer in Ireland, a teacher in Canada, a soldier in India. She did not always know what to do with that knowledge, but she refused to look away. One of her first quiet acts was to change the way the royal household operated. She did not make grand decrees, nor did she seek to erase tradition. Instead, she introduced small shifts, a request that meals be simpler, that the staff be treated with more respect, that children in service be given time to learn to read. She noticed things others overlooked. A maid who limped from standing too long, a page boy who fell asleep during long ceremonies, a cook who wept quietly after receiving news from home. And when she noticed, she acted not with fanfare, but with quiet instruction. A pair of softer shoes ordered, a letter sent to a grieving family, a tutor hired for the boy who wanted to study. These were not policies, they were gestures. But in their accumulation, they began to change the air of the palace, making it feel less like a fortress of privilege and more like a home where care could exist, even within the rigid walls of monarchy. Albert, now by her side as prince consort, became not just her husband, but her closest advisor, not because he demanded influence, but because she trusted his judgment. He did not seek titles or public recognition. He asked only to be useful. And so, in the evenings, after the formal duties of the day had ended, they would walk together through the palace gardens, or sit by the fire in the drawing room, talking for hours. They spoke of politics, yes, but also of science, of art, of how a nation might balance progress with compassion. He introduced her to new ideas, about education, about industry, about the potential of technology to improve lives. He was not a man of empire in the traditional sense. He was a man of thought, of order, of quiet innovation. And in his presence, she found not only love, but clarity. He did not tell her what to do. He helped her see what was possible. One of their earliest shared projects was the idea of a great exhibition, a gathering of the world's inventions, arts and crafts to be held in London. It was not an immediate success. Many in Parliament scoffed at the notion, calling it a folly, a waste of time and money. What good is a show of machines and trinkets, they asked. But Victoria and Albert believed it could be more than that. They saw it as a celebration of human ingenuity, a way to bring nations together not through war, but through wonder. And so, with quiet persistence, they worked, reviewing designs, meeting with engineers, writing letters to foreign leaders inviting their participation. The idea grew slowly, like a seed in dark soil, until it could no longer be ignored. When the Crystal Palace finally rose in Hyde Park, a vast shimmering structure of glass and iron, it was not just a building, it was a promise. A vision of what the world could become, if guided by curiosity rather than conquest. But not every step forward was met with approval. There were whispers in the corridors of power, murmurs from ministers who resented Albert's presence in affairs of state. "He is not English," they said. "He has no right to advise the Queen." Some even suggested he was manipulating her, that a foreign prince had too much influence over the crown. Victoria heard these words, though they were often spoken behind closed doors. She did not respond with anger. She did not issue rebukes. Instead, she continued to consult him, to walk beside him in public, to include him in meetings. Her silence was her answer. Her presence beside him was her declaration. She would not be told who she could love, nor who she could trust. And slowly the murmurs faded, not because they were silenced, but because they were outlasted by consistency. She also began to shape the image of the monarchy in ways that were subtle but profound. At a time when kings and queens were expected to be distant, almost divine, she chose intimacy. She allowed portraits to be made of her with her children, not posed and formal, but caught in quiet moments, reading, laughing, holding a baby. She visited hospitals, not for spectacle, but to sit with the sick, to hold their hands, to listen. She wrote personal letters to families who had lost sons in colonial conflicts, words that were not drafted by secretaries, but by her own hand. These acts were small, but they carried weight. They suggested that the crown could be not just a symbol of power, but of care, that a queen could be both sovereign and human. There was a morning, early in her reign, when she received a letter from a young woman in Manchester who worked in a textile mill. The letter was stained with soot, the handwriting uneven, but the words were clear. She wrote of 12-hour days, of children as young as 6 working at the looms, of air so thick with cotton dust that it burned the lungs. She did not ask for money. She did not demand revolution. She simply asked if the Queen knew. Victoria read it once, then again, then a third time. She did not reply immediately. She did not sign a law that day, but she kept the letter. She placed it in a small wooden box on her desk, where it remained for years. And every time she passed it, she remembered. That letter did not change the world in a day, but it changed her. And from that moment on, the word child labor carried a face, a voice, a name. She began to use her influence in quiet ways, supporting bills that limited working hours, advocating for better education, encouraging the expansion of public parks so even the poor could breathe clean air. She did not always succeed. The wheels of government turned slowly, and many in power had too much to lose. But she persisted, not with speeches, but with presence, with questions asked in private meetings, with nods of approval to reformers who needed only a whisper of royal support to gain courage. She learned that power was not always in the decree, but in the pause, the moment when a ruler could choose to look away, but instead chose to see. And then there were the children. As her family grew, 9 in total, the palace began to echo with laughter, with the pitter-pat of small feet, with the sound of lullabies sung in both English and German. This, too, was a quiet revolution. A queen was not expected to be a hands-on mother. She was expected to delegate, to let nurses and governesses do the work of raising heirs. But Victoria refused. She bathed her babies. She rocked them to sleep. She taught them their letters, told them stories, scolded them gently when they misbehaved. In doing so, she redefined what it meant to be a royal woman, not as a figure of state, but as a mother, a teacher, a guide. And in that redefinition, she gave permission to others to value the quiet, unseen work of care. Albert shared this world with her completely. He played with the children, built them toys from wood, taught them music, took them on walks through the gardens at Osborne House. He believed in education, in discipline, in the importance of moral grounding. But he also believed in joy. He would dance with the little ones in the drawing room, make them laugh with silly voices, lie on the grass with them to watch clouds drift across the sky. These were not royal duties. They were human moments. And in their accumulation, they became a kind of legacy not written in laws, but lived in the hearts of those who witnessed them. She continued to write in her diary every night, long after the household had gone to sleep. The entries were no longer just about her thoughts or feelings, but about the small decisions of the day, whom she had met, what she had learned, what she hoped to do tomorrow. She wrote about Albert's ideas, about the children's progress, about the weight of the letters she had read. She did not write for history. She wrote to remember, to process, to stay grounded. And in that ritual, she found a kind of center, a way to return to herself amidst the endless demands of being queen. There were still moments of doubt, nights when she sat by the fire, wrapped in silence, wondering if she was doing enough, if her small steps mattered in a world so vast and broken. She thought of the factories, the colonies, the people whose lives were shaped by decisions made in rooms like hers. She did not have the power to fix everything. She never would. But she had learned this. That change did not always come in waves. Sometimes it came in drops, in choices. In the way she spoke to a servant, the way she held a child, the way she listened to a man from India who came to discuss trade, not as a subject, but as a person. And so, step by quiet step, the path unfolded. Not with triumph, not with glory, but with continuity. She attended council meetings. She signed documents. She hosted dignitaries. She walked in the gardens. She loved her husband. She raised her children. She remembered the letter from Manchester. She kept the flame of attention alive, even when no one was watching, because she had come to understand something essential, that leadership was not in the grand gesture, but in the daily return to duty, to empathy, to the belief that even a small act, repeated over time, could shape the world. Because that is what these first steps were, not the beginning of a revolution, but the quiet laying of a foundation. Not a single moment of change, but a series of choices, each one small, each one intentional. A letter answered, a child held, a decision made not for convenience, but for conscience. And as the years passed, those steps would become a path, and that path would become a legacy. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to keep walking, slowly, steadily, with eyes open, heart awake, and hands ready to do what they could. There is a kind of movement that does not announce itself with noise or spectacle, but with the quiet shift of balance, like the moment a ship, long moored to the dock, begins to feel the pull of the tide beneath its hull, not with a lurch, but with a slow, almost imperceptible release. It is not the world changing all at once, but the realization that it has already begun to change, that the air itself carries a different weight, that the paths people walk are no longer quite the same as they were yesterday. This was the motion that began to ripple outward from the quiet decisions of a young queen who had chosen, not to command, but to care, to listen, to question, to act in small ways that, over time, gathered into something larger than any single act could be. And though no one rang a bell to mark its beginning, though no newspaper declared it with bold print, the world was in motion, and nothing would ever be exactly as it had been. The first signs were not in grand proclamations, but in the texture of everyday life, in the way a factory owner in Manchester paused over his morning tea, reading a parliamentary report on child labor that had been quietly endorsed by the Crown, and for the first time truly saw the names listed: Emily, age 9, Thomas, age 7, Mary, unable to stand for more than 2 hours. He had known, of course, that children worked in the mills. He had lived with it as one lives with the weather, as something inevitable, part of the system. But now, the words were not abstract. They were attached to faces he had never seen, to lungs he had never heard coughing in the damp night air. And though he did not close the mill that day, nor change the hours, he asked his foreman to check on the ventilation in the weaving room. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, when they are sincere, have a way of spreading. In London, the city itself seemed to breathe differently. The gas lights that flickered along the streets at dusk now stayed lit longer, their pale glow stretching the boundaries of the day, allowing people to walk home after work, to gather in quiet conversation, to read by artificial light in rooms that had once gone dark with sunset. For the poor, who had lived entirely by the rhythm of daylight, this was a quiet revolution, not in laws, but in time. The ability to move after dark, to study, to rest without rushing into shadows, changed the texture of life. And in the homes of the growing middle class, there were pianos, books, newspapers, small signs of a life that was no longer defined only by survival, but by culture, by thought, by the quiet pleasure of reading a story after supper, of playing a melody passed down from a grandmother, of imagining a future that might be different from the past. The arrival of the railways was not just a technological shift, but a transformation of the soul of the nation. A man could wake in Liverpool, eat breakfast in his own kitchen, and dine in London by nightfall, something that would have been unimaginable just a generation before. Letters that once took days to cross the country now arrived in hours. Families separated by distance could visit. Workers could travel for jobs. Ideas moved faster than ever. And though the steam engines were loud, their smoke dark, their arrival disruptive, shaking the earth with their passage, scaring horses, shattering the silence of villages, they also carried a promise. That distance was no longer an absolute barrier, that the world could be stitched together one rail at a time, that no one needed to be entirely alone. The sound of the train in the distance became a new kind of heartbeat for the land. And at the center of this motion stood the Crystal Palace, that vast, shimmering cathedral of glass and iron, rising in Hyde Park like a dream made visible. It had not been easy to build. There had been doubts, delays, storms that threatened the fragile structure. Engineers argued, politicians hesitated, the public murmured about the cost. But Victoria and Albert believed in it, not as a monument to power, but as a celebration of human ingenuity, a gathering of the world's inventions, arts, and crafts from every corner of the earth. When it opened, filled with wonders, a giant telescope from Germany, a steam loom from America, silks from Japan, clocks that could keep time for a century, people walked through its halls in silence, their breath catching at the sight of so much possibility gathered in one place. And though the Queen did not give a speech, her presence was felt, walking slowly, listening, asking questions, smiling at a child who reached out to touch a display. She did not need to speak. Her attention was her affirmation. But not all welcomed this motion. In the quiet corners of power, there were those who whispered that the Queen was changing too much, too fast, that her marriage to a German prince had brought foreign influence into the heart of the monarchy, that her interest in science and industry was unbecoming of a woman, let alone a sovereign. Some ministers resented her questions, her notes in the margins of reports, her insistence on being informed. She should leave governance to men, they said in private drawing rooms, over glasses of port. Her role is to appear, not to act. But Victoria did not retreat. She did not argue. She simply continued, reading, meeting, deciding. Her presence a quiet rebuttal to every doubt. She did not need to shout. Her consistency was her answer. Even in the colonies, the motion was felt, not everywhere, not all at once, but in enough places to be noticed. In India, where the British presence had long been one of control and extraction, a new tone began to emerge. Schools were built, not just for the elite, but for local children. Hospitals opened in towns that had never seen a doctor. Railways extended into the interior, not only to move troops and goods, but to connect villages, to bring teachers, books, hope. A young Indian student in Calcutta, studying medicine under a new scholarship program, wrote in a letter, "I did not think the Queen would care about us, but she asks after our progress. She signs the papers. She remembers." These words were not widely read, but they were true. And truth, once spoken, has a way of traveling, quietly like a seed carried on the wind. At home, the royal family itself became a model of the new era. No longer distant, untouchable figures carved in stone, they were seen in portraits, in public appearances, in the press, as parents, as partners, as people. The image of Victoria and Albert with their children, gathered around a piano or walking in the garden, was printed in newspapers and displayed in homes. It suggested that a family could be both noble and warm, both powerful and kind. And in that image, a new ideal of domestic life began to form, one where duty and love were not opposites, but companions, where leadership could be gentle, where strength could be quiet. Mothers looked at those pictures and felt, for the first time, that their own struggles with children, with household, with exhaustion, were not beneath notice, but part of something sacred. The press, once a tool of scandal and gossip, began to shift as well. Newspapers grew in number and reach, carried by train and telegraph, arriving in villages the same day they were printed in London. And though many still focused on crime and sensation, others began to cover social issues, the conditions in factories, the plight of the poor, the need for reform. A new kind of journalism emerged, one that did not just report, but questioned. And sometimes, in the quietest paragraphs, a letter from the Queen was quoted, not for its political weight, but for its tone, its compassion, its curiosity, its refusal to look away. These words did not change laws overnight, but they changed hearts. And hearts, when moved, begin to ask for more. Even the land itself seemed to respond. In the Highlands of Scotland, where Victoria and Albert retreated each summer, the quiet village of Balmoral became a place of pilgrimage, not for worship, but for memory. Locals spoke of the Queen walking alone through the heather, her face turned toward the wind, her hands clasped behind her back. She did not come as a ruler, but as a guest. She bought wool from local weavers, ate bread from the village oven, greeted children by name. She walked the same paths as the shepherds, paused at the same streams, listened to the same birdsong, and in her presence the land felt seen. Years later, an old woman would say, "She didn't change the mountains, but she made them feel important." And perhaps that was enough. The telegraph, that thin wire carrying words across nations in seconds, became another thread in this growing web of connection. A message from London could reach Bombay in minutes. A decision made in the morning could affect lives by nightfall. It was a power unlike any before, invisible, instantaneous, almost magical. And yet, Victoria used it with care. She did not flood the empire with commands. She sent short notes, inquiries, condolences. When a cyclone struck Bengal, she sent a single line, "I grieve with you." It was not a policy. It was a presence. But for those who received it, it was enough. It meant they were not forgotten. And in a world so vast, being remembered was its own kind of salvation. Art and music, too, began to reflect this motion. Composers wrote pieces inspired by industry, by travel, by the new pace of life. Painters captured not just royalty in battle, but workers, families, cityscapes alive with smoke and light. Literature turned inward, exploring the minds of ordinary people, their struggles, their hopes. The Victorian age was becoming not just an era of steam and steel, but of soul, a time when the inner life was given space to breathe, to question, to dream. Novels spoke of moral dilemmas, of love and loss, of the quiet courage it took to live honestly. And in those pages, people saw themselves, not as cogs in a machine, but as beings with depth, with feeling, with a right to be heard. And still, the Queen wrote. Every night, without fail, she opened her diary and filled page after page with the quiet record of her days. She wrote of meetings, yes, but also of walks, of conversations with Albert, of the way the light fell on the garden at Osborne in the late afternoon. She wrote of her children growing, of letters received, of dreams she could not explain. These were not documents of state. They were acts of preservation, of memory, of feeling, of the self beneath the crown. And in their quiet honesty, they became a kind of compass, guiding her through moments of doubt, reminding her who she was when the world demanded so much. The diary was her sanctuary, a place where she could be small, where she could wonder, where she could simply be. The world in motion was not always graceful. It stumbled. It groaned under the weight of its own growth. Children still worked in factories. Colonies still suffered under the weight of empire. Poverty still clung to the edges of cities like ivy on a wall. Victoria did not believe she had fixed everything. She never would. But she had learned this, that to care was not weakness, that to listen was not surrender, that to act, even in small ways, was to resist the silence that so often accompanied power. She did not need to solve every problem. She only needed to face them, one by one, with attention, with intention, with the quiet courage of showing up. And so, the motion continued, not because of a single decree, but because of 1,000 small choices. A letter answered, a law supported, a child held, a moment of stillness in a noisy world. Each one added weight to the wheel. Each one helped it turn. And as the years passed, the momentum grew, not as a force, but as a current, carrying people, ideas, hopes forward, like leaves on a slow, steady river. No one could say exactly when the tide had turned, but everyone could feel it, because that is how change often comes, not with a shout, but with a whisper, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of presence. And Victoria, by simply being who she was, thoughtful, steady, quietly courageous, had become part of that whisper. She did not see herself as a force of history, but history, in its quiet way, had chosen her, not for her power, but for her persistence, not for her voice, but for her silence, the kind of silence that listens, that waits, that holds space for others to speak. And so the world moved, not perfectly, not equally, but forward, and in its motion there was hope, not loud, not certain, but real, like the first light of dawn, barely visible, yet undeniable, like the sound of a train in the distance, carrying someone home, like the flicker of a gaslight in a window, long after everyone should be asleep, where a woman sits writing in her diary, her pen moving slowly across the page, shaping a future she will never fully see, but will have helped to create. Because the world is always in motion, not because of great men, but because of quiet women, not because of thunder, but because of rain that falls softly, night after night, until the ground can no longer hold it, and the river begins to rise. There are moments in a life when the path forward does not shine with clarity, when the weight of duty and the pull of the heart stand in quiet opposition, and no choice feels entirely right. These are not the crises of war or scandal, not the kind that echo in history books with bold headlines, but the deeper, slower struggles, the ones that happen behind closed doors, in the silence between breaths, in the way a hand hesitates over a letter or a gaze lingers too long on a portrait. For Victoria, this time came not with a single event, but as a gradual pressing in from all sides, the expectations of a nation, the whispers of a court, the needs of a family, and the quiet, unrelenting voice within that asked, again and again, "Who am I when no one is watching?" She had begun to walk her own path, yes, and the world had responded, slowly, unevenly, but surely. Yet with every step forward, new tensions arose, not from enemies, but from the very structures meant to support her. The ministers who had once doubted her now questioned her reliance on Albert, suggesting that a foreign prince should not have such influence over matters of state. They did not say it in council, not openly, but in the pauses between sentences, in the way a document was delayed, in the careful wording of a reply. The prince consort is most involved, they would say, their voices smooth, their eyes avoiding hers. And though she did not shout, did not demand answers, she felt it, the subtle resistance, the invisible wall that could not be touched, only sensed, like a draft beneath a door. Albert, for his part, carried the weight with quiet dignity. He did not seek titles. He did not demand recognition. But he worked, tirelessly, thoughtfully, advising on policy, organizing exhibitions, supporting scientific advancement, shaping the education of their children. He believed in order, in progress, in the idea that power could be used not for domination, but for uplift. And yet, even he could not escape the murmurs. "He is not English," they said in drawing rooms and clubs. "He speaks with an accent. He dresses differently. He thinks too much." These were not accusations, not laws, but small cuts, repeated over time until they left a mark. And Victoria saw it, the way his shoulders tightened when he entered a room, the way he paused before speaking, as if measuring the cost of each word. But it was not only from the outside that the pressure came. Within the palace, within her own heart, there were conflicts just as real. She was a queen, yes, but also a mother, to one child, then another, then many, each arrival a joy, each cry in the night a reminder of a different kind of duty. The world expected her to be present, to rule, to appear, and yet her children needed her to stay, to hold them, to sing them to sleep. There were nights when she would stand in the nursery, watching them breathe in the dim light, their faces soft with sleep, and wonder if she could truly be both, if she could lead a nation and still be a mother in the way she wished to be. No one offered her a choice. She was expected to do both, perfectly, without complaint, without showing the strain. And then there was Ireland. The letters began to arrive with more frequency, their ink smudged, their paper thin, as if written in haste and sorrow. Reports of failed crops, of hunger spreading through villages, of families eating weeds to survive. She read them late at night, by candlelight, her hands growing colder with each page. She wanted to act. She wanted to send aid, to speak, to do something, anything that would ease the suffering. But the ministers advised caution. "It is a matter for local governance," they said. "The market will correct itself." She did not believe them. She had seen enough of poverty, of neglect, to know that waiting was not neutrality. It was complicity. And yet, to speak too loudly would be seen as overreach. To act too boldly would be called interference. So she waited. She listened. She wrote private notes, sent quiet funds, asked questions in meetings, not with anger, but with persistence. It was not enough, but it was all she could do. There were times when the loneliness pressed in like fog, not because she was unloved. She had Albert, her children, her journals, but because the role she carried was one that no one else could truly share. She could not turn to a friend and say, "I am afraid I am failing." She could not confess her doubts in public, could not show uncertainty without risking the stability of the crown. And so she learned to carry it all, the weight of empire, the grief of a nation, the love of a family, in silence. She would walk alone in the gardens at Balmoral, her shawl pulled tight against the Highland wind, her boots pressing into the damp earth, and for a few moments she would simply breathe. No titles, no duties. Just a woman, walking, thinking, enduring. The press, once a quiet supporter, began to turn its gaze more sharply. Some newspapers praised her devotion to family, her moral clarity, her steady presence. But others questioned her seclusion, her reliance on Albert, her decisions in Ireland. Is the Queen truly leading? One asked. Or is she being led? The words stung, not because they were loud, but because they carried a grain of truth. She was being shaped by her husband, by her children, by the needs of the moment. But was that weakness? Or was it simply being human? She did not have a clear answer. She only knew that she was trying every day, in every small way, to do what felt right. Even her body began to speak in quiet rebellion. The pregnancies took their toll. The late nights, the endless meetings, the emotional labor of being always on, always composed, always the queen. It wore on her. There were mornings when she woke with a heaviness in her chest, not from illness, but from exhaustion. She would lie still, listening to the clock tick in the hall, the distant cry of a bird outside, the soft rustle of a servant moving down the corridor. And in those moments, she would allow herself a single thought: I am so tired. But then she would rise. She would ring for her dressers. She would sit at her desk. She would begin the day again. Albert saw it. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she paused longer before answering, the rare moments when her voice trembled, and he did not offer solutions. He did not tell her to rest, to step back, to abandon her duties. Instead, he sat with her. He held her hand. He played softly on the piano in the drawing room, melodies that required no words, only listening. He reminded her, not with speeches, but with presence, that she was not alone. And in that quiet companionship, she found a strength that did not come from power, but from love. There were also the expectations of womanhood, unspoken, yet ever present. A queen should be dignified, modest, restrained. She should not be too interested in politics, too visible, too present. And yet, Victoria was all of those things. She read state papers. She expressed opinions. She met with ministers. She shaped policy. And though she did it with grace, with care, with a voice that never rose above a calm tone, it unsettled those who believed a woman's place was in the background. She is too involved, they whispered. She forgets her nature. But she did not forget. She simply refused to be confined by it. And still, she continued, not with defiance, not with rebellion, but with a quiet, unwavering commitment to her own sense of duty, not as it was defined by others, but as she understood it in her heart. She supported reforms for workers. She advocated for better housing. She encouraged the expansion of public parks, so even the poor could walk among trees. She did not always succeed. She did not always see the results. But she believed in the value of trying, in the dignity of effort, even when the outcome was uncertain. There was a morning, early in the spring, when she received a letter from a schoolteacher in Glasgow. He wrote of a new classroom built with royal patronage, of children who had never held a book now reading aloud, of parents who came to visit, their eyes filled with pride. He did not ask for more. He simply wanted her to know. She read it 3 times. Then she placed it in her desk drawer, beside the letter from Manchester, the one about the child laborers. She did not frame it. She did not show it to anyone. But she returned to it, in quiet moments, as a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, even when the world seemed unmovable, something was shifting, not because of force, but because of persistence. She learned slowly that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it was the decision to stay at your desk when you wanted to retreat, to sign a document when you doubted its wisdom, to hold your child close when you knew you would have to let go, to love deeply in a world that demanded detachment, to keep writing in your diary when no one would ever read it. These were not grand acts, but they were hers. And in their accumulation, They became a kind of resistance, not against enemies, but against resignation. And so, the conflicts did not vanish. They remained, in the court, in the press, in her own mind. But she did not break. She adapted. She endured. She found ways to move forward without declaring war, to lead without shouting, to care without losing herself. She did not have the answers. She never would. But she had something else, a quiet certainty that doing what felt right, even in small ways, was not weakness. It was the deepest form of strength. Because silent courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to continue, even when the path is unclear, even when the world watches with doubt, even when the heart aches with the weight of it all. And Victoria, in her rooms lit by candlelight, in her walks through misty gardens, in her letters written in careful script, was learning to carry that courage, not as a banner, but as a breath, not as a weapon, but as a rhythm. A steady, quiet rhythm, like the ticking of a clock in an empty hall, marking time, marking presence, marking life. And in that rhythm she found her way, not to victory, not to triumph, but to peace. Not the peace of having won, but the peace of having tried, of having listened, of having loved, of having stayed. There are moments in a life that do not arrive with warning, not with thunder or prophecy, but in the quiet shift of a breath, the faintest tremor in a voice, the way a hand feels colder than it should, as if the warmth that once lived within it had begun to retreat, slowly, imperceptibly, like light fading from a room at dusk. These are the moments that, in hindsight, will be seen as boundaries, not lines drawn in stone, but thresholds crossed without knowing. The last evening when the world still felt familiar, the final morning when the future seemed like a continuation of the past. For Victoria, that moment came not in a battlefield, not in a council chamber, not with the roar of history, but in the stillness of a bedroom at Windsor Castle, where the fire had burned low, the curtains were drawn against the winter night, and the man who had walked beside her for 21 years began to fade, not with drama, but with a slow, unbearable quiet, as if his presence were being gently erased from the world, one breath at a time. It began with a chill, not the kind that comes from an open window or a draft in the hall, but one that seemed to rise from within, as though his body had become a vessel no longer able to hold the life it had carried for so long. Albert had been working as he always did, his mind sharp, his hands steady, reviewing plans for a new exhibition, reading reports, discussing the education of their sons, his voice calm, his gestures precise, the same quiet strength that had been her anchor through decades of change. And then, one afternoon, he paused in the middle of a sentence, his hand resting on the edge of the desk, his face turned slightly toward the light that fell through the tall windows, and said only that he felt unwell, tired, nothing more. She looked at him as she had 1,000 times before, and saw the same calm eyes, the same quiet strength. But something in the tone of his voice, something in the way he did not immediately rise to continue, made her pause. She asked if he needed to rest. He smiled, as he always did, and said it would pass. And so they both believed, not because they were unaware, but because the mind refuses to see the edge until it is already stepping over, because love cannot imagine a world without the one it loves. He took to his bed not as a sick man, but as one in need of a few days' quiet, a temporary withdrawal from the rhythm of duty. The doctors came, their voices measured, their hands careful, their eyes avoiding hers a little too long. They spoke of typhoid, of fever, of the water supply at Windsor, as if the cause could be found in pipes and wells, not in the slow wearing down of a body that had given everything to thought, to order, to service. They did not say the word dying. They did not need to. It was in the way they whispered in the hallway after checking his pulse, in the way their instructions grew more frequent, in the way they looked at her with a kind of sorrow that was not for the patient, but for the one who would remain. Victoria sat beside him, hour after hour, holding his hand, reading aloud from a book of poetry, speaking softly of the children, of the garden, of the letter he had been writing. She did not weep. She did not cry out. She simply stayed, present, watchful, refusing to leave even when urged to rest, as if her presence could hold him in the world a little longer, as if love, sustained and silent, might be enough to turn back the tide. The room became a world unto itself, sealed off from the rest of the palace, from the empire, from time. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows on the walls, where the flicker of candlelight made the portraits seem to breathe. The air was warm, thick with the scent of beeswax, medicine, and the faint musk of illness. But beneath it all, a coldness had settled, not in the temperature, but in the quality of the silence, in the way sound seemed to hesitate before filling the space. The clocks ticked with a kind of solemnity, each chime echoing through empty corridors, marking hours that no longer mattered. And in the center of it all, Albert lay, his breath growing shallower, his skin pale, his hands, once so full of purpose, now resting limply on the coverlet, as if they had forgotten how to hold anything but hers. The children came, one by one, dressed in their quietest clothes, their voices hushed, their eyes wide with a fear they could not name. They did not fully understand, not yet, but they felt the weight of the silence, the way their mother's face changed when she looked at their father, the way the servants moved like shadows, speaking in whispers, pausing outside the door to listen. The youngest, Beatrice, was held in her arms as she approached the bed. Albert opened his eyes, smiled faintly, and reached out to touch her cheek. It was a small gesture, barely more than a brush of fingers, but it carried the full weight of a lifetime of love, of fatherhood, of a man who had shaped not only a queen, but a family. And then he closed his eyes again, as if gathering strength for the next breath, the next word, the next moment that would never come, as if even in his fading, he was still trying to be present, still trying to say goodbye. Night fell slowly, as it always does, but this one felt different, longer, deeper, as if time itself had thickened, as if the universe had paused to witness the quiet unraveling of a life. The wind in the trees outside spoke in low murmurs. The distant bark of a dog carried through the dark, the rustle of leaves brushing against stone. But inside, everything had narrowed to the space around the bed, to the sound of his breathing, uneven and shallow, to the way his fingers occasionally tightened around hers, as if to say, "I am still here. I am still with you. Do not let go." She did not sleep. She could not. Every time her eyes closed, she felt the fear that he might slip away in the silence, that she would miss the last thing he wanted to say. So she stayed awake, watching his face, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the way his hair had grayed at the temples, the quiet dignity that had never left him, even in weakness, as if he were still, in some essential way, Prince Albert, not just a man in pain, but a man of principle, of love, of purpose. She thought of their first meeting, of the way he had listened to her as no one else ever had, not as a queen, but as a woman, as if her thoughts mattered, as if her dreams were worth his attention. She thought of the walks through the gardens at Osborne, the quiet evenings by the fire, the way he would play the piano softly while she wrote in her diary, the music weaving through the silence like a second voice. She thought of the letters they had written, the reforms he had quietly shaped, the way he had believed in progress, not for power, but for people. And she realized, with a sorrow that had no words, that she had never told him enough how much he meant to her, not because she didn't know, but because she had always believed there would be more time, because love, in its deepest form, assumes permanence, even when nothing in life promises it. The fever rose. His breathing grew more labored, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a release. The doctors came again, their faces grave, their voices lower than before. They spoke of prayers, of comfort, of letting go. She did not argue. She did not demand miracles. She only asked to be left alone with him. When the room emptied, she leaned close, her lips near his ear, and whispered words that no one else would ever hear. Not a plea, not a command, just a simple, quiet truth. I have always loved you. You made me who I am. He did not open his eyes, but his hand moved slightly in hers, as if in answer, as if to say, I know, and I have loved you just as deeply. And then, sometime after 2 a.m, as the first light of dawn still lingered below the horizon, his breath slowed and stopped. There was no sound, no final word, just silence, deep, complete, absolute, as if the world itself had held its breath and now exhaled. She did not cry at first. She sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling the warmth still in his skin, knowing that the man who had been her compass, her partner, her closest friend, was gone. The room was still. The fire had burned to embers. The candles flickered in their holders, their wax pooling like frozen tears. And in that moment, the world she had known, the one shaped by their shared purpose, their quiet understanding, their life built together, ended. Not with a collapse, but with a release, like a ship untethered from its dock, drifting into open water, with no destination, no map, no hand to guide it. When she finally rose, it was not with urgency, but with the slow, deliberate movement of someone carrying a weight too great to rush. She rang for the servants. She gave instructions in a voice that did not tremble, that did not break, as if the act of speaking clearly could keep the grief at bay. She asked for the children to be told gently. She did not collapse. She did not scream. She simply began the work of living after loss, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, because there was no one else, because the empire still turned, because the letters still arrived, because the world, in its cruelty and kindness, did not stop for sorrow. In the days that followed, the palace became a place of hushed grief. Black drapes were hung over windows and doors. The furniture was covered in cloth. The mirrors were turned to the wall. The children moved through the halls as if in a dream, their laughter silenced, their games forgotten, their eyes searching for a father who would not come. Victoria withdrew into herself, not in anger, not in denial, but in a kind of deep inward stillness, as if her soul had retreated to a place where no one could reach her. She wore black from that day forward, not as a performance, not as a symbol for the public, but as a truth. The woman she had been, the one who laughed with her husband by the fire, who walked with him through the gardens, who shared his dreams, was gone, and in her place was someone new, someone shaped by absence, by memory, by the quiet, unrelenting weight of continuing. She returned to his room many times in the weeks that followed, not to weep, not to shout, but to sit in the chair beside the bed, to look at his clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, to run her fingers over the papers on his desk, the ink dried in the pen, the last sentence unfinished. She did not touch them. She only looked, as if by being there, she could feel him still present, not in body, but in the space he had occupied, in the silence he had left behind, in the way the air still carried the faintest trace of his cologne, the way the chair still held the shape of where he had sat. The world outside did not stop. The empire still turned. The trains still ran. The telegraphs still carried messages across oceans. But for her, time had fractured. There was before and after, and she was now, irrevocably, in the after. She continued to rule. She signed documents. She met with ministers. But her heart was elsewhere, in the past, in the memory of a voice, in the echo of footsteps that would never cross the hall again, in the silence where his advice used to be. She asked the same questions, but now she had to answer them alone. And yet, in that grief, something began to shift. Not at first, not for a long time. But slowly, like light returning after a long night, she began to see that his presence was not gone. It was transformed. It lived in the schools he had helped build, in the exhibitions he had organized, in the values he had taught their children. It lived in the way she still asked, "What would Albert think?" before making a decision. It lived in the quiet strength she now carried, not because she felt strong, but because she had no choice, because to break would mean he had truly left, and she could not allow that. She did not speak of him often, but when she did, her voice changed, softer, deeper, as if speaking his name required a different kind of breath, as if it were a sacred act. She kept his rooms exactly as they were. She wore his dressing gown when the nights were cold. She played his favorite music on the piano, the notes rising into the silence like prayers. These were not acts of madness. They were acts of love, quiet, enduring, unashamed, a refusal to let go, not because she could not move on, but because she did not want to forget. And in the deepest part of her grief, a question began to form, not with words, but with feeling. How do I go on? Not for the empire, not for the children, but for herself. How does a heart continue when the one it beats for is gone? There was no answer, only the next breath, the next step, the next day. And so she took them, one by one, not with courage, not with hope, but with the quiet, stubborn act of continuing. Because sometimes the deepest courage is not in fighting, but in breathing, in waking up, in lighting the candle, in writing the letter, in being there. Because a turning point is not always a decision. Sometimes it is simply the moment you realize you have crossed a threshold you cannot return from. And all that is left is to walk forward, not with strength, but with the memory of it, not with light, but with the echo of it. And so she did, not because she wanted to, but because she could. And in that choice, unspoken, unseen, made in the silence of a bedroom lit by dying candles, the next chapter of her life began, not with a beginning, but with an ending. And from that ending, a new kind of strength would slowly grow, one shaped not by joy, but by loss, not by presence, but by the deep, quiet courage of those who carry love beyond death, who keep walking, not because the path is clear, but because the one they loved would have wanted them to. There are seasons in a life that do not follow the turning of the year, not marked by leaves or snow, but by the slow, almost imperceptible shift in the weight of the heart, times when the world outside continues as usual. The sun rises, the birds sing, the clocks tick on with their usual indifference. But within, everything has settled into a different rhythm, one measured not by hours, but by memory, not by tasks, but by the quiet, unrelenting presence of absence. This was the season Victoria entered after Albert's death, not by choice, not with preparation, but as one steps into deep water without knowing how to swim, only that you must keep moving. That stopping is not an option. That to breathe is already an act of courage. Grief did not come to her as a storm, not all at once, but as a slow settling, like dust after a collapse, fine, pervasive, impossible to sweep away completely, clinging to the edges of rooms, to the folds of fabric, to the silence between words, to the way the morning light fell across his empty chair, untouched, unmoved, as if time itself had paused out of respect for what had been lost. She did not leave Windsor for months. The palace, once a place of family life and quiet work, now felt like a sanctuary of memory, every corridor echoing with the ghost of his presence, every room holding a trace of the man who had shaped her reign, her family, her very sense of self. She walked the same paths they had walked together, her shawl pulled tight against the wind, her footsteps slow, as if matching the pace of a man who was no longer there, as if by walking slowly enough, she might keep him close a little longer. She visited his room each day, not to weep, not to speak aloud, but simply to sit, to breathe the air that still carried the faintest trace of his cologne, to look at the books on his shelf, the pen lying beside an unfinished letter, the gloves resting on the table as if he had only stepped out for a moment, as if he might return at any time, shrug off his coat, sit by the fire, and say, "Tell me about your day." These were not relics. They were not displays. They were not even symbols. They were simply there, part of a world that had not yet accepted that he was gone, a world that still believed in his return, not with logic, but love. The children needed her. They moved through the halls like shadows, their laughter silenced, their questions unanswered, their eyes searching for a father who would not come, for a mother who was still with them in body, but distant in spirit. They did not understand why she stayed in the rooms, why she wore black every day, why she no longer walked with them in the garden as she once had, why the piano was silent, why the evenings were so quiet. And Victoria saw it. She saw their confusion, their fear, their need for her to be present in a way she no longer knew how to be. But the truth was, she was still with him, not in body, but in mind, in heart, in the endless loop of memory that played behind her eyes. His smile, the way he tilted his head when listening, the sound of his voice saying her name, the warmth of his hand on hers, the quiet way he would brush a strand of hair from her face when he thought she wasn't looking. These were not just memories. They were presences. And in them, she found a kind of companionship that the world could not take away. She began to write to him, not in her diary, not as a record, but as a letter, long, intimate, filled with the small details of the day, as if he were still abroad, still reachable by post. "The roses are blooming again," she wrote. "I walked by the lake this morning. The swans were there, just as they were last year. I wished you could have seen them. The children asked about you at dinner. I told them you were watching over us. I believe it, you know. I believe you still are." She did not send them. She placed them in a drawer beside his portrait, as if one day he might return and read them, or as if the act of writing could keep the connection alive, could make the distance feel smaller. It was not madness. It was love, not diminished by death, but transformed, reshaped into a conversation that no longer required an answer, a monologue spoken into the silence, not because she expected a reply, but because she could not bear to stop speaking. The world outside did not stop. The empire still turned. The telegraph still carried news of distant conflicts, of trade agreements, of political shifts. Ministers came to her with documents to sign, with questions to answer, with decisions that could not wait. And she attended to them, not with passion, not with urgency, but with duty, as if the act of ruling were the one thing that still connected her to a sense of purpose, the one thread that tied her to the world of the living. She signed the papers. She gave her assent. She met with ambassadors. But her heart was elsewhere, in the past, in the silence, in the space beside her that would never be filled again. She did not resent the work. She did not refuse it. But she carried it like a stone, not because it was heavy, but because it reminded her that life, in its most basic form, continued, that the world did not stop for sorrow, that duty was not a choice, but a rhythm, like breathing. And yet, in that stillness, something began to shift, not suddenly, not with clarity, but like the first light of dawn, barely visible, yet undeniable, like the faintest warmth on the skin after a long winter night. She started to notice things again, not with the sharpness of attention, but with the softness of recognition. The way the mist rose from the lake in the early morning, curling like smoke over the water. The sound of a bird singing outside her window, persistent, hopeful, as if it had never known grief. The warmth of a cup of tea in her hands, the steam curling into the air like a whisper, the scent of bergamot rising like a memory. These were not joys. They were not happiness. But they were notices, small acknowledgments that the world still offered beauty, even in sorrow, that life, in its quiet way, was still inviting her to see it, to feel it, to be part of it. She returned to Osborne House, their home in the Isle of Wight, not because she wanted to, but because the children needed the sea air, needed space to run, to laugh, to remember their father in a place that had been full of life. The house was just as he had left it, his study untouched, his clothes in the wardrobe, his favorite chair by the window, facing the sea. And yet the sea was different. It did not mourn. It moved, as it always had, with the tide, with the wind, with a rhythm older than grief. She walked along the shore one evening, the sky painted in soft pinks and grays, the waves breaking gently on the sand, the sound rising and falling like a lullaby. And for the first time in months, she felt something that was not pain, not joy, not relief, but a kind of peace, as if the vastness of the ocean had made her sorrow feel smaller, not less real, but part of something larger, as if her grief were not the center of the world, but a single wave in an endless sea. She began to read again, not state papers, not reports, but poetry, philosophy, the books Albert had loved. She found solace in the words of Tennyson, in his In Memoriam, written for a lost friend, lines that spoke of love beyond death, of faith in the unseen, of the slow return of light after darkness. I hold it truth with him who sings, to one clear harp and divers tones, that men may rise on stepping stones, of their dead selves to higher things. She read them not once, but many times, underlining passages, folding corners of pages, as if the act of marking them could make their truth more real. And in those lines she found a companion, not in flesh, but in thought, in feeling, in the quiet understanding that she was not alone in her grief, that others had walked this path before her, and had found, not answers, but ways to keep walking, not light, but the courage to move toward it. She also began to listen, not just to ministers or letters, but to the people. She received a woman from Lancashire who had lost her husband in a mining accident, and for the first time, Victoria did not respond as a queen, but as someone who understood loss. She held the woman's hand. She did not offer solutions. She simply said, "I know what it is to miss someone every day. I know how the silence hurts. I know how the world keeps moving when you wish it would stop." And in that moment, something shifted, not in policy, but in connection. The woman left with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of being seen, of being heard, of knowing that even a queen could understand. And Victoria realized that her grief, as private as it was, could also be a bridge, not to fix the world, but to meet others in their pain, to offer not answers, but presence, not solutions, but solidarity. She did not return to public life all at once. She did not force herself to smile, to appear, to pretend, but she allowed herself small returns, a visit to a hospital, a letter to a grieving family, a quiet walk through the village near Balmoral, where the locals did not expect her to speak, only to be present. And in those moments, she began to feel not like the woman she had been before, but like someone new, not healed, not whole, but enduring. She learned that healing is not the absence of pain, but the ability to carry it without being crushed. That love does not end with death, but changes form. That courage is not always loud, but often quiet, the courage to wake up, to breathe, to take one more step, even when the path is dark, even when the heart feels too heavy to beat. She kept his rooms exactly as they were. She wore his dressing gown on cold nights. She played his favorite music on the piano, the notes rising into the silence like prayers. These were not acts of refusal, not signs of being stuck. They were acts of love, a refusal to let go, not because she could not move forward, but because she did not want to forget. And in that remembrance, she found a kind of light, not bright, not warm, but steady, like the glow of a candle in a window, visible from far away, a sign that someone was still there, still watching, still caring. She did not need to erase him to honor her duty. She could carry him with her, not as a burden, but as a presence, a guide, a quiet voice in the back of her mind that asked, what would Albert think? Before she signed a document, before she made a decision, before she spoke to a child, she began to understand that loss was not a failure, but a testament to the depth of what had been loved, to the strength of what had been shared. Albert was gone, yes, but his influence remained in the schools he had supported, in the values he had taught their children, in the quiet reforms he had shaped, in the way she still believed in progress, in education, in the dignity of labor, and in her, most of all. She was still his partner, not in life, but in legacy. Every decision she made, every letter she wrote, every moment she chose kindness over indifference, was a continuation of what they had built together, a quiet rebellion against the idea that death could erase love. And so, the lessons came not in words, but in moments, in the way a child's hand felt in hers, in the way the sun touched the garden at dusk, in the way a single line of poetry could make her breath catch, in the way a stranger's tears could make her feel less alone. She learned that grief does not disappear. It becomes part of you, like a scar, like a memory in the bones. But it does not have to be the only thing you are. She learned that solitude is not always loneliness, that silence can be full, that love, once given, never truly leaves, that to mourn is not weakness, but fidelity. She did not become a different woman. She became more herself, not the queen the world expected, not the widow in black, but the woman she had always been beneath the crown, thoughtful, steady, deeply feeling. And in that authenticity, a new kind of strength emerged, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, like a river that continues to flow even when the surface is still, like a tree that grows stronger, not by resisting the wind, but by bending with it. She began to write in her diary again, not just about duty, but about feeling. I miss him today, she wrote. But I also saw the first snowdrop. It made me pause. It made me breathe. It made me remember that life, in its quiet way, is still beautiful. These were not declarations. They were not victories. They were acknowledgments, small, honest, human. And in them, she found a way back to herself, not all at once, but in pieces, like a mosaic slowly being reassembled. Because loss, when met with honesty, can become a teacher. And light, when sought in stillness, can be found not in the sun, but in the quiet glow of a heart that refuses to stop loving, that continues to care, that chooses to stay, not because it is easy, but because it is right. And so, the season of stillness began to change, not because the pain ended, but because she learned to carry it, not because she forgot, but because she remembered in a new way, not with sorrow alone, but with gratitude, for the years, for the love, for the man who had walked beside her, who had shaped her, who had believed in her. And in that gratitude, a new kind of peace began to grow, not loud, not complete, but real. Because sometimes the deepest healing is not in forgetting, but in remembering without breaking, in loving without fear of loss, in living, not in spite of grief, but because of what was loved. And so she continued, not with a fanfare, not with a return to the world, but with a quiet step forward, then another, each one small, each one steady, each one a whisper to the man she had lost. I am still here, and I am carrying you with me. There is a kind of presence that does not announce itself with fanfare, not in the roar of crowds or the carving of names in stone, but in the quiet accumulation of small things, a school built in a village, a law passed after years of silence, a child reading a book who would not have had one a generation before. This was the way Victoria's legacy began to take shape, not through grand declarations, not with the force of conquest, but with the steady rhythm of attention, of care, of a woman who, after decades of living in the public eye, had learned that true influence was not in commanding the world, but in listening to it, in allowing her choices, even the quietest ones, to ripple outward like a stone dropped into still water, unseen but felt, like a current that moves not by strength, but by persistence, shaping the banks not in a single rush, but over time. She did not seek to be remembered. She did not speak of her impact, nor measure her reign by monuments or maps. But as the years passed, as the world continued to turn, the signs of her presence began to appear in places she would never visit, in lives she would never know. In a classroom in Calcutta, a young girl traced the letters of the alphabet on a slate, her fingers moving slowly, carefully, the same way Victoria had once done in her own lessons at Kensington Palace. The school had been funded through royal patronage, approved in silence with no ceremony. No one had told the girl that the Queen, far away, had read the proposal, had underlined a sentence about girls' education, had written in the margin, "This is important," but it was. And because someone had believed it, the girl could now write her name, could imagine a future where her voice might be heard, where her thoughts might matter, where she might not be defined only by duty, but by possibility. In Manchester, a factory owner, not a reformer, not a politician, but a man who had once dismissed talk of workers' rights as sentimental nonsense, began to shorten the hours in his mill. He did not do it for praise. He did not make an announcement. But when asked, he said only that he had read a report from the Crown on labor conditions, and that it had stayed with him. He thought of his own daughters. He thought of the Queen, who had raised 9 children, who had spoken, in quiet moments, of the dignity of work, of the need for fairness, of the belief that no one should be worked to exhaustion. He did not know if she still cared, but he had the sense that she would want this. And so he changed, not everything, not all at once, but enough. And in that enough, a new standard began to form, not by law, but by example, not by enforcement, but by the quiet weight of a monarch who had, over decades, become a moral compass, not because she claimed it, but because she lived it. The Crystal Palace, though it had been dismantled and moved, remained in the memory of the nation, not just as a marvel of glass and iron, but as a symbol of what could happen when curiosity was honored over fear, when the world came together not to trade or to fight, but to show what it could create. Long after the great exhibition had ended, people still spoke of it, in homes, in schools, in quiet conversations over tea. It had planted a seed, the idea that progress did not have to mean loss, that industry could coexist with beauty, that a nation could celebrate not only its power, but its people. And Victoria, though she had not built it with her own hands, had protected it, believed in it, stood beside Albert as he brought it to life. Her quiet presence at its opening had been a kind of blessing, not spoken, but felt, like the warmth of sunlight on stone, like the hush before music begins, like the first breath of a child, full of promise. She continued to wear black, not as a performance, not as a demand for sympathy, but as a truth, a daily reminder of what had been lost, of the man who had shaped her, who had believed in service, in education, in the quiet dignity of doing good. But in that black, something new had begun to emerge. She was no longer just a widow. She was a presence, steady, enduring, unwavering. When she appeared, even in silence, people felt it. Not the energy of youth, not the fire of revolution, but the deep, quiet strength of continuity. She did not need to speak to be heard. She did not need to move to be seen. Her very existence became a kind of reassurance that someone was still watching, still caring, still holding the line, not with force, but with fidelity, not with spectacle, but with the quiet certainty that duty, when lived over time, becomes a kind of love. In the colonies, her name began to carry a different weight, not just as the ruler of an empire, but as a figure of moral authority. A governor in Jamaica, facing pressure to suppress a peaceful protest, paused before acting. He thought of the Queen's letters, not orders, but reflections, questions about justice, about fairness, about whether a people could be governed by respect rather than fear. He remembered that she had once written, "We govern not by force, but by example." He did not know if she still remembered the colony, if she even knew of the protest. But he had the sense that she would not want bloodshed, that she would not want fear to be the foundation of rule. And so he chose dialogue. It was a small act, but it was part of a pattern, a slow shift in the tone of rule, not in every place, not all at once, but in enough to matter, like a single bird singing at dawn, then another, until the forest is full of song. She did not claim credit. She did not demand recognition. But she continued to read, to write, to listen. Her desk was still covered in letters, from soldiers, from mothers, from inventors, from farmers. She answered many herself, not with official replies, but with words in her own hand. I grieve with you. I thank you. I see you. These were not policy. They were presence. But presence, when repeated over decades, becomes influence. And influence, when rooted in empathy, becomes legacy. A woman in Australia, who had lost her son in a mining accident, kept the Queen's letter folded in her apron pocket, not because it changed her loss, but because it made her feel less alone. And in that feeling, in that small acknowledgement, the empire, for a moment, became not a machine of control, but a network of care. Her children grew, and with them, the reach of her values. They married into royal families across Europe. Yes, but more importantly, they carried with them the quiet lessons of their parents, of duty, of education, of the importance of family, of the belief that leadership could be gentle, that power could be used not to dominate, but to serve. When her granddaughter became Empress of Russia, when her grandson sat on the German throne, when her daughter founded a hospital in Germany, they did so not only with titles, but with a sense of purpose shaped in the drawing rooms of Osborne, in the gardens of Balmoral, in the quiet evenings when their parents spoke not of power, but of responsibility, of kindness, of the quiet courage it takes to do what is right when no one is watching. Victoria did not control their lives, but she had shaped their hearts. And in that shaping, her legacy extended far beyond the borders of her empire, into the very bloodlines of Europe. Even in the smallest gestures, her influence could be felt. A new park opened in Birmingham, funded by a royal grant, designed for families, for children to play, for the poor to walk among trees. A hospital in Edinburgh expanded its care for women in childbirth, inspired by the Queen's own experiences, her advocacy for better medical training, her belief that no mother should suffer needlessly. A school for the blind in London received a visit from the royal family, not a formal inspection, but a quiet afternoon, with music, with conversation, with the sense that these lives mattered, that they were not invisible. These were not isolated events. They were threads in a growing fabric, a vision of a society where care was not a luxury, but a principle, where dignity was not earned, but assumed. She did not see herself as a reformer. She did not believe she had changed the world, but she had changed its tone. Where once the monarchy had been distant, almost mythical, it was now associated with presence, with moral grounding, with a quiet sense of duty that did not seek applause. People began to expect more, not of spectacle, but of integrity. They looked to the crown not for entertainment, but for stability, for a sense that someone was still holding the line, even as the world rushed forward, even as steam and steel reshaped the landscape, even as new voices rose from the shadows demanding change. And in that expectation, her quiet consistency became a kind of revolution, not loud, not violent, but deep, like the roots of an ancient tree, unseen, but holding the earth together. And still, she wrote. Every night, Without fail, she opened her diary and filled page after page with a quiet record of her days. She wrote of meetings, yes, but also of walks, of letters received, of the way the light fell on the garden at Osborne in the late afternoon, of the sound of rain on the roof, of the laughter of her grandchildren. She wrote of her children, her memories of Albert, of dreams she could not explain. These were not documents of state. They were acts of preservation, of memory, of feeling, of the self beneath the crown. And in their quiet honesty, they became a kind of compass, guiding her through moments of doubt, reminding her who she was when the world demanded so much. The diary was her sanctuary, a place where she could be small, where she could wonder, where she could simply be, where she could remember that she was not only a queen, but a woman. The world in motion was not always graceful. It stumbled. It groaned under the weight of its own growth. Children still worked in factories. Colonies still suffered under the weight of empire. Poverty still clung to the edges of cities like ivy on a wall. Victoria did not believe she had fixed everything. She never would. But she had learned this, that to care was not weakness, that to listen was not surrender, that to act, even in small ways, was to resist the silence that so often accompanied power. She did not need to solve every problem. She only needed to face them one by one, with attention, with intention, with the quiet courage of showing up, of being present, of not turning away. And so, emotion continued, not because of a single decree, but because of 1,000 small choices. A letter answered, a law supported, a child held, a moment of stillness in a noisy world. Each one added weight to the wheel, each one helped it turn. And as the years passed, the momentum grew, not as a force, but as a current, carrying people, ideas, hopes forward like leaves on a slow, steady river. No one could say exactly when the tide had turned, but everyone could feel it, like the subtle shift in the air before a storm, like the first warmth after a long winter, like the quiet hum of a city waking up. Because that is how change often comes, not with a shout, but with a whisper. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of presence. And Victoria, by simply being who she was, thoughtful, steady, quietly courageous, had become part of that whisper. She did not see herself as a force of history, but history, in its quiet way, had chosen her. Not for her power, but for her persistence. Not for her voice, but for her silence. The kind of silence that listens, that waits, that holds space for others to speak, that allows the world to breathe. And so the world moved, not perfectly, not equally, but forward, and in its motion there was hope. Not loud, not certain, but real, like the first light of dawn, barely visible, yet undeniable, like the sound of a train in the distance, carrying someone home, like the flicker of a gaslight in a window, long after everyone should be asleep, where a woman sits writing in her diary, her pen moving slowly across the page, shaping a future she will never fully see, but will have helped to create. Because the world is always in motion, not because of great men, but because of quiet women, not because of thunder, but because of rain that falls softly, night after night, until the ground can no longer hold it, and the river begins to rise. And in that quiet, the legacy took shape, not in stone, but in spirit, not in conquest, but in care, not in glory, but in the 1,000 small choices that, together, became a life of meaning, a life that touched others not by force, but by continuity, by the quiet certainty that someone was still there, still watching, still believing. And so, without fanfare, without ever claiming it, Victoria's reign became more than an era. It became a feeling, the feeling that someone was watching, someone cared, someone believed that even in the midst of empire, in the noise of progress, in the weight of tradition, there was still room for kindness, for dignity, for the quiet voice that says, I see you, I remember. I am still here. And that, perhaps, was the deepest legacy of all, not in laws, not in maps, not in titles, but in the way a generation began to believe that a leader could be both powerful and gentle, that a woman could be both strong and tender, that a life lived with attention could shape the world not by moving mountains, but by tending the garden. Because legacy is not always what we build. Sometimes it is what we allow to grow, quietly, slowly, without knowing, in the hearts of those who carry our values forward, not because they were commanded, but because they were inspired. And so the legacy took shape, not with a beginning, but with a continuation, not with a single act, but with a lifetime of small ones. And in that lifetime, a whisper became a presence became a path, and a path became a quiet, enduring light. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to time, not the silence of emptiness, not the hush of a room abandoned, but the silence of fullness, of moments gathered and held, like letters pressed between the pages of a book no one has opened in years, their ink still legible, their emotions still alive. It is the silence of a life that has stretched so long it begins to blur the edges between the personal and the historical, between the woman and the age that bears her name. This was the silence that began to settle around Victoria as the decades passed, not because she was gone, but because she had become part of the fabric of time itself, not a figure of the present, but a presence in the past, one whose life had stretched so long, touched so much, that the world had begun to remember her, even while she was still breathing, as if her very existence had become a kind of living memory, a quiet landmark in the flow of years. She had reigned longer than any monarch before her, and with each passing year, the sense of her grew not louder, but deeper, like a bell that has stopped ringing, but whose vibration still moves through the air, through the stones of cities, through the hearts of those who had grown up with her face on coins, with her name in school books, with the quiet understanding that she had been there through it all. People spoke of her not as a woman, but as a force, the queen who had been there during the rise of the railways, the spread of the telegraph, the quiet transformation of a nation from smoke and candlelight to steam and electricity. They said, "I remember when the queen was young," or "my grandmother remembered the day she became queen," as if her life were a thread woven through generations, connecting the past to the present in a way that felt both ordinary and sacred. And yet, in her rooms at Osborne or Balmoral, she was still simply Victoria, writing in her diary, walking in the garden, holding a grandchild's hand, unaware of the weight her name was beginning to carry, unaware that her quiet consistency had become a kind of anchor in a world that was learning how to move too fast. The world around her had changed beyond recognition. London, once a city of gaslights and horse-drawn carriages, now pulsed with electric trams, telephones, and the distant hum of industry. Children played not with wooden toys, but with tin soldiers and clockwork animals. Newspapers printed photographs, not just words, and her face, older now, framed by white hair, eyes still sharp, lips pressed in quiet thought, appeared in homes across the empire, not as a distant ruler, but as a familiar presence, like a grandmother watching from the wall, like a voice that had always been there, even if you had never heard it speak. And yet, she did not feel like a symbol. She felt like a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had endured, who had tried to do what was right, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, because someone had to, because silence was not an option when you had been given a voice, however quiet. She continued to write in her diary every night, though her hand trembled slightly now, the ink sometimes smudging as she pressed too hard, as if the weight of the pen had grown with the years. The entries were no longer about the details of meetings or the names of visitors, but about memory, about Albert, about the children when they were small, about the way the light used to fall on the lake at Windsor in the late afternoon, golden and still, like honey poured over water. She wrote of dreams she could not explain, of voices she thought she heard in the wind, of the way a certain scent, lavender, beeswax, the sea, could bring her back to a moment so vivid it felt real, as if time had folded in on itself and allowed her to step inside it again, if only for a breath. These were not the writings of a queen. They were the writings of a woman who knew she was nearing the end of her journey, and who wanted to remember not what she had done, but who she had been. Not the crown, but the girl who once sat by a window, wondering what her life might become. Her children had grown, and so had her grandchildren. They came to visit with their own children, filling the quiet halls with laughter, with small feet running on polished floors, with voices that spoke of new schools, new inventions, new ways of thinking. She listened to them with care, not to correct, not to command, but to understand. She did not always agree. She did not always understand the world they described, a world of bicycles, of women demanding the vote, of ships that could cross the ocean without sails, of ideas that questioned the very foundations of empire. But she listened, and in that listening she honored them, just as Albert had once honored her curiosity, just as she had once honored the quiet voices of those who wrote to her from distant lands. She knew she would not live to see the future they spoke of, but she wanted to believe it could be good, that the values she had tried to live by, kindness, duty, care, the quiet courage of showing up, might still have a place in it, even if the world no longer needed a queen to remind them. The empire, once a vast red stain on the map, had begun to shift. Not all at once, not with rebellion, but with a slow turning, like a great ship changing course in deep water, its momentum carrying it forward, even as the rudder begins to pull in a new direction. Colonies that had once been ruled without question were beginning to speak of self-governance, of identity, of a future beyond the crown. She did not resist. She did not rage. She simply observed, with the quiet sadness of someone who knew that all things, even empires, have their season, that nothing lasts forever, not even the longest reign. She had not built it. She had inherited it. And now it was becoming something else, not because of her failure, but because time, in its quiet way, demands change, because the world grows, and with it, the understanding of justice, of dignity, of what it means to belong. And so she let go, not with surrender, but with acceptance, like a tree that releases its leaves in autumn, knowing that the roots remain, knowing that the soil remembers. In the villages of England, in the towns of Canada, in the cities of India, people began to tell stories about her, not the official history, not the dates and decrees, but the small things, how she visited a hospital during a storm, how she wrote a letter to a grieving mother, how she walked alone in the gardens at Balmoral, her face turned toward the wind, her hands clasped behind her back, as if in conversation with the silence. These stories were not always true, not in the way of facts, but they were true in feeling, true to the sense that she had cared, that she had been present, that she had not forgotten the weight of being human, that she had not let power erase empathy. And in that truth, her legacy grew not from conquest, but from continuity, not from force, but from the quiet certainty that someone was still there, still watching, still believing. She did not seek to be immortal. She did not believe in statues or monuments, though they were built. She understood, in her final years, that memory is its own kind of eternity, not in stone, but in the hearts of those who carry your values forward, who repeat your words without knowing they are yours, who live by a quiet standard you helped to set. A school teacher in Manchester told her students that honesty and duty were not old-fashioned ideas. A nurse in Calcutta said, "We do this because someone once believed it mattered." A young woman in London, fighting for the right to vote, carried a photograph of the Queen in her pocket, not because Victoria had supported her cause, but because she had shown that a woman could be strong without being cruel, that power could be held with grace, that dignity did not require distance. And still, she wore black. Not as a performance, not as a demand for remembrance, but as a truth, a daily act of fidelity to the man who had shaped her, who had believed in progress, in education, in the quiet dignity of doing good. But in that black, something new had begun to emerge. She was no longer just a widow. She was a presence, steady, enduring, unwavering. When she appeared, even in silence, people felt it. Not the energy of youth, not the fire of revolution, but the deep, quiet strength of continuity. She did not need to speak to be heard. She did not need to move to be seen. Her very existence became a kind of reassurance that someone was still watching, still caring, still holding the line, not with force, but with fidelity, not with spectacle, but with the quiet certainty that duty, when lived over time, becomes a kind of love. She visited the gravesite at Frogmore often, not with ceremony, but with the quiet habit of someone returning to a place of peace. She would sit on the bench beside the mausoleum, her shawl pulled tight, her hands folded in her lap, and speak to him as she had in life, not in words, but in silence, in presence, in the way the heart remembers. She did not ask for signs. She did not expect visions. But she felt him there, in the rustle of leaves, in the warmth of the sun on stone, in the way the light fell through the trees in the late afternoon, casting long shadows that looked like hands reaching across the grass. And in that feeling, she found not grief, but connection, not loss, but love that had not ended, but changed form, that had become part of the air, part of the earth, part of the quiet rhythm of the world. The press, once skeptical, now spoke of her with reverence. They called her the grandmother of the empire, not because she was soft, but because she had endured. They wrote of her reign as an age, the Victorian era, as if her name had become the measure of a time, as if the values she had lived by, order, duty, moral seriousness, quiet compassion, had become the soul of a generation. She did not claim it. She did not correct them. But she understood that her life had become more than a personal journey. It had become a mirror, reflecting the changes of a world in motion, the hopes and fears of millions who had lived under the same sky, who had grown up with her face on coins, with her voice in the silence of their homes, with the quiet sense that someone somewhere was still paying attention. She did not see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a woman who had tried to love, to lead, to listen, to endure, to care even when no one was watching, to do what felt right even when it was not easy. And in that trying, she had become something larger than herself, not because she was perfect, but because she had persisted, not because she was always right, but because she had cared. And in a world that often rewards noise, her quiet consistency had become a kind of revolution, not loud, not violent, but deep, like the roots of an ancient tree, unseen, but holding the earth together, like a single candle in a dark room, not bright enough to illuminate the walls, but enough to make the shadows feel less absolute. As her body weakened, as the years pressed upon her with increasing weight, she began to dream more vividly of Albert, of her children as they once were, of the young girl she had been, writing in her diary by candlelight, wondering what her life might become. She did not fear death. She did not resist it. She saw it not as an end, but as a return to stillness, to memory, to the quiet that had always been her companion, to the peace of no longer needing to carry the weight of a crown, of simply being without title, without duty, without the need to be seen. She had lived through storms, through grief, through change, and now she was ready to rest. And still she wrote. Every night, without fail, she opened her diary and filled page after page with the quiet record of her days. She wrote of walks, of letters received, of the way the light fell on the garden at Osborne in the late afternoon. She wrote of her grandchildren, of dreams she could not explain. These were not documents of state. They were acts of preservation, of memory, of feeling, of the self beneath the crown. And in their quiet honesty, they became a kind of compass, guiding her through moments of doubt, reminding her who she was when the world demanded so much. The diary was her sanctuary, a place where she could be small, where she could wonder, where she could simply be. The world in motion was not always graceful. It stumbled. It groaned under the weight of its own growth. Children still worked in factories. Colonies still suffered under the weight of empire. Poverty still clung to the edges of cities like ivy on a wall. Victoria did not believe she had fixed everything. She never would. But she had learned this, that to care was not weakness, that to listen was not surrender, that to act, even in small ways, was to resist the silence that so often accompanied power. She did not need to solve every problem. She only needed to face them, one by one, with attention, with intention, with the quiet courage of showing up. And so, the motion continued, not because of a single decree, but because of 1,000 small choices. A letter answered, a law supported, a child held, a moment of stillness in a noisy world. Each one added weight to the wheel. Each one helped it turn. And as the years passed, the momentum grew, not as a force, but as a current, carrying people, ideas, hopes forward, like leaves on a slow, steady river. No one could say exactly when the tide had turned, but everyone could feel it, because that is how change often comes, not with a shout, but with a whisper, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of presence. And Victoria, by simply being who she was, thoughtful, steady, quietly courageous, had become part of that whisper. She did not see herself as a force of history, but history, in its quiet way, had chosen her, not for her power, but for her persistence, not for her voice, but for her silence, the kind of silence that listens, that waits, that holds space for others to speak. And so the world moved, not perfectly, not equally, but forward, and in its motion there was hope, not loud, not certain, but real, like the first light of dawn, barely visible, yet undeniable, like the sound of a train in the distance, carrying someone home, like the flicker of a gaslight in a window, long after everyone should be asleep, where a woman sits writing in her diary, her pen moving slowly across the page, shaping a future she will never fully see, but will have helped to create. Because the world is always in motion, not because of great men, but because of quiet women, not because of thunder, but because of rain that falls softly, night after night, until the ground can no longer hold it, and the river begins to rise. And in that quiet, the memory gathered, not in stone, but in spirit, not in conquest, but in care, not in glory, but in the 1,000 small choices that, together, became a life of meaning, a life that touched others not by force, but by continuity, by the quiet certainty that someone was still there, still watching, still believing. And so, without fanfare, without ever claiming it, Victoria's reign became more than an era. It became a feeling, the feeling that someone was watching, someone cared, someone believed that even in the midst of empire, in the noise of progress, in the weight of tradition, there was still room for kindness, for dignity, for the quiet voice that says, I see you, I remember, I am still here. And that, perhaps, was the deepest legacy of all, not in laws, not in maps, not in titles, but in the way a generation began to believe that a leader could be both powerful and gentle, that a woman could be both strong and tender, that a life, lived with attention, could shape the world not by moving mountains, but by tending the garden. Because legacy is not always what we build. Sometimes it is what we allow to grow, quietly, slowly, without knowing, in the hearts of those who carry our values forward, not because they were commanded, but because they were inspired. And so the memory gathered, not with a beginning, but with a continuation, not with a single act, but with a lifetime of small ones. And in that lifetime, a whisper became a presence became a path, and a path became a quiet, enduring light. There is a kind of presence that does not fade with time, not because it is carved in stone or printed in books, but because it lives in the quiet rhythm of things, in the way a woman pauses before speaking, in the way a child is taught to care, in the way a leader chooses to listen rather than command. This is the presence Victoria left behind, not as a monument, not as a name on a map, but as a tone, a texture, a feeling that something important was lived, not for glory, but for continuity. And though she is long gone, though the empire she ruled has dissolved into memory, though the world has moved far beyond the gaslight and steam of her time, her echo still whispers, not in words, but in the spaces between them, in the choices that favor kindness over power, in the belief that duty can be gentle, that strength can be quiet. We do not speak her name often. We do not bow when we pass a statue, but we carry her in ways we do not notice, in the idea that a woman can lead, not by force, but by presence, in the belief that a ruler might care about the poor, not as a gesture, but as a duty, in the understanding that grief is not weakness, but a testament to love. These are not laws. They are not decrees. They are values, worn smooth by time, like stones in a river, shaped not by one hand, but by the slow flow of years. And somewhere in that flow, her life became part of the current, not the loudest wave, but a steady one, carrying something forward, even when no one is watching. Think of the homes where her image still hangs, not in palaces, but in old books, in schoolrooms, in the corners of museums, where light falls softly on a photograph of a woman in black, her eyes steady, her hands folded. A child might pause before it, not knowing who she was, but feeling something, a sense of seriousness, of depth, of a life that meant more than appearances. And in that pause, the echo stirs, not with a voice, but with a question. What does it mean to live a long life well? It is a question she asked herself every night, pen in hand, fire low, the world asleep around her. And now it passes to us, not as a demand, but as an invitation. Think of the nurses who still wear uniforms inspired by those she supported, of the schools that bear names from her reign, of the quiet parks in cities where people walk not to work, but to rest, to breathe, to remember they are alive. These are not grand tributes. They are not empires, but they are her legacy, not in conquest, but in care, not in red on a map, but in green in a city, in the way a mother reads to her child under a tree, in the way a man sits alone on a bench, watching the world go by, allowed to be still because someone, long ago, believed that peace was worth protecting. She did not believe in perfection. She knew she had failed, that she had been blind to suffering, that she had lived within a system that caused pain, even as she tried to soften its edges. She did not claim to have fixed the world, but she tried, not once, not in a single act, but every day, in small ways, in letters written, in decisions made with thought, in the refusal to look away. And in that trying, she left a mark not on the surface of history, but in its depths, like a stone dropped into water, unseen, but felt in the ripples that move outward long after it has sunk. And so, her echo lives in those who try too, in the teacher who stays late to help a struggling student, in the doctor who listens to a patient's fears, in the parent who chooses patience over anger, in the leader who values listening over speaking. These are not heroic acts. They are not recorded in headlines. But they are the quiet work of a world that believes, however faintly, that care matters, that attention is a form of love, that presence is a gift. And in them, Victoria's life continues, not as a memory, but as a practice. She would not recognize the world now. The speed, the noise, the endless flow of images and words, it would overwhelm her. but she would recognize the heart of it, the longing for connection, the need for stability, the quiet hope that someone somewhere is still paying attention. And perhaps, in that recognition, she would smile, not with triumph, but with tenderness, like a grandmother watching her family grow, knowing she cannot follow them into their future, but trusting that something of her has been carried forward, not in name, but in spirit. We do not need to wear black to honor her. We do not need to live by her rules or believe in her empire, but we can honor the depth of her attention, the consistency of her care, the way she stayed, even when the world asked too much, even when grief threatened to pull her under. We can honor her by choosing in our own small ways to stay, to show up, to listen, to write the letter, to believe that small things, repeated over time, can shape the world. Because legacy is not always what we build. Sometimes it is what we allow to grow, quietly, slowly, without knowing, in the hearts of those who carry our values forward, not because they were commanded, but because they were inspired. A young woman in a parliament today might speak with calm authority, not knowing that a century ago, a queen in mourning showed her that a woman could be both strong and tender. A man might choose to grieve openly, not ashamed, because he once read of a queen who wore black for 40 years, not for show, but for love. These are not direct lines. They are whispers. But whispers, when repeated, become voices. And so the echo continues in the way we care for the sick, in the way we raise our children, in the way we remember those we have lost. It lives in the quiet courage of those who lead not with force, but with presence, who believe that dignity is not earned, but assumed, that justice should be gentle, that power should serve, not dominate. These are not Victorian values. They are human ones. But she lived them at a time when they were not expected, when the world demanded spectacle, when silence was mistaken for weakness. And in living them, she made them visible. Perhaps that is the deepest gift of history. Not the dates, not the battles, not the names, but the quiet realization that we are not alone in our longing to do good, to love deeply, to endure. That others have walked paths of grief, of duty, of quiet courage, and have left behind not answers, but examples. And in their example, we find not pressure, but permission to be soft, to be strong, to be both, to be human. So as you lie here tonight, perhaps you can feel it, not as a voice, but as a stillness, as a breath that slows, as a thought that softens. The echo is not loud. It does not demand your attention. It simply exists, like the warmth of a cup of tea long after the fire has died, like the scent of lavender in an old drawer, like the way a certain light at dusk makes you pause, not knowing why. It is the feeling that you are part of something larger, not by force, but by continuity, that your life, however small it may seem, is a thread in a story that has been unfolding for generations. And perhaps, in this quiet, you can ask yourself, what echo will I leave? Not in monuments, not in fame, but in the way I treat a stranger, in the way I love my family, in the way I carry my grief, in the way I choose to show up, even when no one is watching. You do not need to change the world. You only need to be true to your heart, to your values, to the quiet voice that says, this matters. Because that is what she did. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but consistently. And in that consistency, she became a presence, not just in history, but in the present, in this moment, in the breath you are taking right now, in the stillness that surrounds you, in the soft hum of the night. So let the echo remain, not as a call to action, but as a companion, not as a demand, but as a comfort. A reminder that you are not the first to feel this way, to carry this weight, to hope in silence, to love beyond loss. And you will not be the last. And as the world turns, as new ages rise and fall, as empires fade and new ones form, perhaps the truest legacy is not in what we conquer, but in what we preserve, the quiet dignity of care, the courage of staying, the belief that even in darkness, a single light, held steadily, can guide others home. So rest now. Let the echo settle around you, like a blanket, like a memory, like a whisper from a woman who lived long, loved deeply, and believed, until the end, that presence was its own kind of power. And if you ever wonder whether your life matters, remember her, not the queen, not the empire, but the woman who wrote in her diary every night, who walked in the garden, who held her child, who chose again and again to stay. Because in that choice, in that quiet, in that continuity, the echo still lives, and it is still whispering, and it is still true. And so we come to rest not with a final word, not with a closing door, but with a quiet breath, like the last note of a lullaby fading into the air, like the soft rustle of pages turning in a book that does not need to end, like the gentle settling of dust after a long journey through time. You have walked far tonight, through foggy mornings in London, through candlelit diaries, through gardens wrapped in mist, through decades of quiet courage, through a life shaped by love, duty, and enduring presence. And now you can let it all go. Let the story settle behind your eyes like dust motes drifting in the last light of dusk. Let the weight of the day sink deeper into the mattress, as if the bed itself is holding you, just as the earth holds every memory, every footprint, every whispered word that was ever spoken in love. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with your breath, with your stillness, with the quiet part of you that knows how to rest. How to receive a story, not as something to remember, but as something to feel, to carry in the silence between heartbeats. If you'd like, you can leave a whisper in the comments. Just a simple, "I'm here," from wherever you are, from a city under streetlights, from a village under stars, from a room where the clock has slowed and the night has grown soft, because it means more than you know to know we are sharing this moment across time and space, in the quiet, in the stillness, in the shared act of letting go. And if this story found you at the right time, if it helped you slow down, if it made you feel less alone in your thoughts, less rushed in your breath, perhaps you would like to stay. Perhaps you would like to return for another journey, through ancient gardens, forgotten letters, quiet revolutions of the heart, because there are more stories waiting, not in haste, not in noise, but in the same gentle rhythm that brought you here tonight, stories that do not demand your attention, but simply offer their presence, like a candle left burning in a window, like a letter written long ago and just now received. But for now, let yourself drift. Let your body feel the support beneath you, the way the earth holds every living thing without effort. Let your mind soften like ink dissolving in water. Let your heart remember that it is okay to rest, that you do not need to carry everything tonight, that you are not asked to be strong, to be certain, to have answers, only to be here, breathing, feeling, being just as you are, in this moment, in this room, under the same sky that once watched over a young girl riding by candlelight, wondering what her life might become. Because just like Victoria, you do not have to be strong all the time. You do not have to have all the answers. You only need to be here, present in your own way, showing up for yourself, for your breath, for the quiet courage it takes to close your eyes and trust that the world will continue without you needing to hold it together. And as the silence grows around you, as the room darkens, as your thoughts begin to float like leaves on a slow river, know that you are not alone. The past walks beside you not as a burden, but as a friend. The world continues gently without demand, and somewhere, in a quiet house, in a bedroom lit by candlelight, a pen still moves across a page, writing a story that will one day become a whisper, just like this one, just like the voice you are hearing now, which will soon become part of your own memory, a soft echo in the mind as you drift. So close your eyes if you have not already, breathe slowly, deeply, as if each breath were a wave returning to the shore, as if each exhale carried away a small weight you no longer need to hold, and let yourself go into dreams, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with the quiet trust that rest is not wasted time, that stillness is not emptiness, that to be here, listening, breathing, letting go, is already enough. Another story will wait for you when you are ready, when the night calls again, when you need a companion for the quiet. But for now, there is only this: the warmth of your blanket, the softness beneath you, the darkness behind your eyelids, and the gentle certainty that you are held by this moment, by this breath, by the long, quiet line of those who came before, and by the peace that comes not from having done everything, but from having been here, fully, softly, completely. So let the echo remain, not as a call to action, but as a companion, not as a demand, but as a comfort, a reminder that you are part of something larger, not by force, but by continuity, that your life, however small it may seem, is a thread in a story that has been unfolding for generations, and that your rest, your breath, your presence matters more than you know. And as you sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of those who loved deeply, who stayed, who showed up, who believed that small things repeated over time could shape the world. And may you wake tomorrow, not with the weight of what you must do, but with the soft memory of having been seen, having been heard, having been here, in this story, in this night, in this breath. Another journey will wait when you're ready.